Good evening. I'm Jason Leosatis. This is Outside the Box. Thanks for joining me this evening. I've got another great guest on tonight. I've got very lucky to have some wonderful guests. This evening I've got Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who's editor and publisher of Politics First magazine. Thank you so very much for joining me, Marcus, on the show.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Oh, you're really welcome. I admire your great work. I always like to tell people how much I admire them first, because we shouldn't need to hear this, but most people don't get told this enough. In the position you're in, you're doing some fantastic work. Always watching what you're doing on RT and your other stuff. You're a great mouthpiece for the truth, and we need more people like yourself. Thank you very much for your work, Marcus. I'll kick us off, Marcus, with the show. We're going to be talking about Ukraine again. Dr. Paul Gray-Roberts on here also this week talking about this massive subject. I'm really fired up about this subject because I know the dangers we face. I'll kick us down the road and say a few words. And we were just saying before we came on about how incredibly obvious it is now that the Washington is lying and cheating, and I'll say that openly, and I can prove that. We saw the tapes and the phone calls when it and I want to get it straight with people before we start here, Marcus, because you're a great mouthpiece for truth, and I want you to tell people, because some people are still believing that it's a conspiracy to talk about Washington, getting that coup going, and that they're in there and they're not doing the right thing. So I want you to mention that quickly just before we carry on, and also. The reason I'm so fired up about this, if people think, my gosh, Jason's really excited about this, well, let me warn everybody here. What we're seeing here could destroy us and the planet. I mean, we're not talking about anything small here. This is meddling and provoking Putin and Washington, and we'll go into that later. I'd like to talk about that, Marcus. This is a very, very serious issue, and I'm looking at Washington and thinking, my God, these people are almost resembling the Nazi Germany madness. It's frightening, Marcus. So can you just talk to people about that first? The fact that it was a coup, and an organised coup, and they've got a horrible agenda ahead. Please just mention that, please.
Well, let's be clear about something. Ever since Ukraine gained its independence in 1991, the Americans have been lusting after Ukraine in order to try and bring it into the West's orbit, to bring it into the European Union, and most importantly, to bring it into NATO. Because in the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even though the new Russia was on its knees, the Americans were very, very aware that the only country in the world that had the capabilities to threaten American dominance globally was Russia. So we had what was known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, or officially known as the Pentagon's Defense Planning Guidance, which stated that Russia is the only country in the world which can A, destroy the United States through nuclear weapons, and B, can challenge American dominance in the world. And the doctrine made it very clear that the countries of the former Soviet bloc, including some of the countries of the former Soviet Union, were to be brought into the West's fold, to be brought into the European Union, and most importantly, to be brought in to NATO. So the Americans, for the last 20 years, have been spending a vast amount of money in Ukraine, officially $5 billion, I suspect a lot more, to try and bring Ukraine away from Russia and into the West's sphere of influence. And what happened last February was a coup which was instigated principally by the Americans, but also the Europeans. Because what we saw last February, in February 2014, was a democratically elected leader, and I emphasize, a democratically elected leader, Viktor Yanukovych, overthrown in a pro-Western coup. Now, that is not democracy. That is not in accordance with the rule of law. But since when has the West ever genuinely been committed to democracy? So that's very, very clear that the Americans in February 2014, they stepped over a red line by deposing Viktor Yanukovych, simply because he wanted Ukraine to pursue closer relations with Russia. Now that instigated the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine, like Syria, like Libya, It's a very, very delicate country. Its makeup is very, very sensitive. But the Americans in particular are ignorant of Ukraine. They don't understand that prior to 1991, Ukraine never existed in any form whatsoever. Its borders, like the borders throughout the rest of the former Soviet Union, were artificially created by the Bolsheviks.
Just got a slight problem there with Marcus's line here. I'm going to just try and get Marcus back a moment. He'll just hang on 1 second. 1 second. This does happen sometimes. It's very frustrating. We'll just give Marcus another call now. Hang on a sec. Here we go. It'd be a shame if we lose Marcus, because Marcus has given us some great truths here on the show. Marcus, you there?
Yes, I'm back now.
Okay, sorry about that, Marcus. It's okay. I was still on air. I'm mentioning to the people, your video's just not on there, Marcus, for a minute. I just said it's a real shame if we do lose Marcus, because we've got some great things to tell people here. Have you got your video switched on there, Marcus?
Yes, all switched on. Can you see me?
I can't see you, no, but I can hear you, and that will be good enough if I can hear you. Because
I tell you what, let me turn. How about now?
That's fine. I can see you again. Let's get Marcus back on.
Now.
Hang on, I'll drag you back across. Hang on. Whoops, there you are. Hi, Marcus, you're back. And I mean, if you go again, we'll just have you on audio. We've got some great things to say. You're a vital guest on the show, and about Ukraine and the debacle, in my opinion, that's going on over there, and the deceit. So, where were you, Marcus?
Well, I was saying to to those of us who are aware and have studied the history of Ukraine, the region of the former Soviet Union, none of us were surprised that a conflict broke out last year, because, as I was saying, Ukraine's borders were artificially created by the Bolsheviks for ideological and administrative reasons, and there was just simply no way people in southern Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, and also parts of central Ukraine were going to tolerate being in the West's orbit, because millions upon millions of people in Ukraine are Russian speaking, either ethnic Russians or Ukrainians who are half Russian, half Ukrainian, etc. And they've always seen Russia as their mother country. And it's very important to state this, that in March 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, held a referendum in the Soviet Union in which the Soviet people were asked, do you want to preserve the Soviet Union? Now, the Baltic states and Georgia and Armenia didn't take part, but the rest of this former Soviet Union did take part, and 76% of the Soviet people voted to preserve the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, the figure was just over 70%. So it shows that the vast majority of the people in Ukraine never wanted to be separate from Russia. That's a very, very important fact to be aware of, because if you're not aware of that, and if you are believing the monstrous misinformation and downright lies that's coming from Western journalists regarding Ukraine, you would think that Ukraine and Russia have nothing in common, and that Ukraine is an alien, and that Russia is an alien country in Ukraine.
Well said, Marcus. That's very, very important information for people, because most people, and by the way, I must say, myself included, don't know all the nuances of this, and I know enough to get me by. But this is why we need people like yourself to explain all those ties. You know, I mean, I've got a few things written down here. I'll never get through it all. I know we're short of time, but you know, I'm very, very worried. I see, and I'm going to say this again for people to realise, I see Washington as, and its behaviour as one of the great, actually, I'll say it, the greatest threat to humanity at the moment, because it's not looking down the timeline at its consequences from decisions made now without vision and wisdom. And I say that very often. And they're creating feedback loops. And they, what worries me is Paul Craig Roberts said this. It was shocking, but true. They won't back down. We've seen it before. They won't back down. It's a trajectory that's being created now. We will get our way. How do you feel about that, Marcus? Is there anything that can torpedo that trajectory of madness? I mean, we know that we've seen Holland and Merkel going in now. I want your opinion on this. I think they're hedging their bets myself, because they can see that the big monster of Washington is staggering like a Frankenstein. And go on, carry on.
Well, Russia in 2015 is not the Russia of the 1990s. The Russia of the 1990s was in meltdown economically, politically, and militarily as a result of the disastrous policies of the reckless Boris Yeltsin. But from 2000 onwards, under Vladimir Putin, Russia has paid off all its IMF loans, which is very, very important, because the IMF is one of the most potent weapons of the American government. But Russia paid off early, in the early 2000s, its IMF loans, and Russia has clawed back a lot of its lost superpower status. Now, what's the evidence for that? Well, we can take Syria. Why didn't the Americans launch a military attack on Syria? Because of Russian strength in the region, the Middle East, because of Russian strength and influence in Syria. If the conflict in Syria was in the 1990s, when Russia was weak, the Americans would have attacked, as they attacked the Serbs, as they attacked the Bosnian Serbs, and as they attacked Serbia over Kosovo in 1999. So I do believe there's good reason to be hopeful in the world that America's campaign for unilateral military adventures around the globe, if it doesn't come to an end, is going to be severely limited, because Russia is back on the international stage and it is blocking America. And if the Ukraine conflict was in the 1990s, perhaps the Americans would be doing a lot more in Ukraine than what they're doing today. So I do believe that Russia in 2015 being strong is a force for peace in the world, and is a force for stability, is a force for international law, and is a force for the mechanisms of the United Nations. Now, the Americans, they don't like that whatsoever, hence why their media outlets and their allies in America, in Europe, are now portraying Russia in a very, very negative light. I mean, you name it, they will blame Russia for everything that's bad in the world. But that's a sign of desperation. Western media and Western governments know they don't have the field to themselves anymore, like they did in the 1990s, when the West played the crucial role in the Yugoslav civil wars, Croatia, Bosnia, and then the attack against Serbia over Kosovo. They could do what they want because their domestic audiences did not have media outlets such as your one, Jason. They didn't have media outlets such as RT, so they could say pretty much what they wanted to their domestic audiences, and they had their domestic audiences on their side. But that was the 1990s, and never again will that be the same. So I think the fact that they are responding in such a vicious way towards Russia today is a good sign, because it shows that they're desperate and that they know that, in their opinion, the good old days of the 1990s are no longer.
Bravo, well said, Marcus. Great to have you on the show. Thanks for all that, and thanks for people like yourself. And the internet is giving people like yourself and other people and RT and everything a chance to speak the truth. Now, what really worries me, Marcus, is that what worries me is that if this will US chuck its toys out of the cot? It's like and like you said, brilliant. Russia's paid off its IMF loans. More, they won't like that. They want everyone under their wing, under their control. They're control freaks, like a bully in a schoolyard. And if anyone doesn't comply, they're going to get done over. But what worries me is that, are they that mad that if they are going down and people are jumping off their ship, the analogy I gave the other day is like Captain Blythe, mutiny on the Bounty, they will take everyone else down with them, rather than lose face. How do you feel about that, Marcus? That really worries me.
Well, I think at the moment, in regard to the sanctions on Russia, the Europeans, they were very reluctant last year to go along with them, but they were forced into it. They were forced into placing sanctions on Russia because of the Americans. And I don't see any evidence, and quite frankly, I don't see how the Europeans will not comply with what America wants over Ukraine. So while privately there will be some tension between American politicians and politicians from, for example, France and Germany, not Britain, of course, but from France and Germany, when push comes to shove, the Germans and the French, they will back the American stance on Ukraine, because Europe is a strategic, staunch ally to America. And what we have to remind ourselves of is that after the end of the ideological Cold War, and I emphasize the ideological Cold War, America started to retreat somewhat from Europe, but they unofficially allowed Germany to run Europe. Now, the first victim of that was the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, because the Americans and the Germans, they didn't want a socialist country in its backyard, and also a country that had close ties to Russia, and a country which could provide Russia with influence in the Balkans in the future. So that is why the West recognized the independence of Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia, which kick-started the civil wars there, because it was a way of preventing Russian influence in a very large and powerful country in Europe. So the Europeans and the Americans, certainly they have disagreements about, for example, Ukraine, and they will share them with each other in private. But Europe is a staunch ally to America, and Europe will go along with what the Americans want, and we've seen that with the sanctions. And I emphasize should, the Obama administration proceed with arming the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian paramilitaries in eastern Ukraine, the Europeans will not criticize that publicly. They will go along with it, but it doesn't mean they will start supplying the Ukrainians themselves with weaponry.
Thanks, Marcus. And really, let's face it, by arming them, they are waging war, an open acting war on Putin, aren't they? Let's be honest about it. That's what it is.
Well, if the West believes that Russia is involved in Ukraine at the moment, and that's a big if, but if they do believe that, they haven't seen anything yet, because if the Americans were to start arming the Ukrainians, then Russia's response would be very, very forceful, because under no circumstance will Russia countenance a Ukraine which is a member of Nato on its doorstep. Absolutely not. That would pose a formidable threat to Russia's national security. That would pose a formidable threat to the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent. And also NATO bases in Ukraine, and let's be frank, that would happen if Ukraine joined NATO, but NATO aircraft operating from Ukraine could reach Moscow in 20 to 25 minutes. And there would be NATO naval bases along the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, for example, Odessa. So if the Americans proceed with arming the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian neo-Nazi and neo-fascist paramilitaries, then Russia's response will be extremely decisive.
Wow. See, now this is why I want to get you on the program, because there's not many people who speak like you, Marcus, who've got the courage to say that, and people say, oh God, it's frightening, it's shock tactics, it's like, alarmists. No, we're not alarmists, folks. we are telling the truth here, and it's very important for you to know that, because most people who say what can we do are complicit because they're voting for these people. And just to remind people, like I said to Paul Craig Roberts said to me, he's like yourself, he doesn't hold back, and he said, they're saying that, what was it, who was it, what's that guy's name? Chuck Hagel, I think, said Russians on NATO's doorstep. I just couldn't believe it. And I said to Paul, it's like me taking a tent to someone's house and pitching it outside and saying, you're on my doorstep. And that's why... Well, go on, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right, and I think that it's very important for your viewers to be aware that at the beginning of 1990, in return for the Soviet Union agreeing to East Germany reuniting with West Germany, Mikhail Gorbachev was given a verbal assurance. Now, a verbal assurance is meaningless, and that is another reason why Mikhail Gorbachev was a hopeless leader and a very, very poor leader for Russia's national interests. But nonetheless, he was given a verbal assurance by George Bush Sr. that in return for Moscow given its consent to East Germany and West Germany reuniting, that NATO would not expand eastwards beyond Germany's borders.
Right.
So that was broken, because what we had in the late 1990s was NATO expanding into the former Eastern Bloc, and then by the early 2000s we had NATO expansion into 3 republics which used to be a part of the Soviet Union: Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. That is a tremendous threat to Russia's security. And how would the Americans like it if there was a Russian military presence in Mexico? They certainly wouldn't tolerate it. They didn't tolerate Soviet ICBMs in Cuba. There was nearly a nuclear war over that because of Kennedy's response. But the point is this: it's all very well and it's all acceptable for Russia to have to put up with NATO on its western borders, but America would never tolerate, they would never countenance a Russian military influence in Mexico. And if we have a look at the moment in Latin America, the Americans are very, very uneasy and very unhappy about how so many countries in Latin America, Venezuela, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, are forming close relations with Russia. They are very, very upset by that. But nonetheless, it doesn't strike the Americans that it's unacceptable what they're doing in Russia's backyard. They're on Russia's borders, and also they are trying to bring not just Ukraine into the West's orbit, they're trying to bring Moldova into the West's orbit, they're trying to bring Georgia into the West's orbit. So people really do need to step back and reassess the situation, listen to what the Russians have to say, and do some reading. Read good history textbooks, and you will see that the picture that Western governments and Western media outlets are painting at the moment is far from accurate. It's far from being an accurate assessment of the situation in Ukraine.
Well said, Marcus. Thanks for that. And I've just jotted a few things down earlier, and I know I'm brutal with it. You know, it's like this ego madness. They want to take over everywhere. And certainly you're right. I'm sure you're right. They would have incinerated Russia immediately if they had done what they're doing now. And when I say what they're doing, people would say, no, it's NATO. Is it NATO, though? I remember when NATO were dropping bombs on Libya, I was thinking, I don't know, perhaps I'm just this guy who's a bit stupid, but I'm thinking, but it's America, it's not NATO. Is NATO a Trojan horse? Are they using it now just as a mask? I think they are, to get anything they like. It's like a madman using any shield it wants, isn't it, Marcus? You know, NATO is just a Trojan horse, isn't it?
Well, you know, America is the unofficial leader of NATO. And why was NATO formed in 1949? To keep the Russians out of Europe, to keep the Germans down in Europe, and to keep the Americans in Europe. I think if we fast forward to 2015, NATO exists to keep the Russians out of Europe, to keep the Americans in Europe, but also to punish any country in the world that pursues an independent foreign policy. And Syria is an excellent example of that. Syria is being targeted by the West because Syria pursues an independent foreign policy and is a historical and traditional ally to Russia. Syria is Russia's eyes and ears in the Middle East. So the Americans are playing a game of chess at the moment in Syria. They know that by using Islamist fighters, and let's not fool ourselves, these people who the Americans are supporting in Syria are, ideologically speaking, the same people who committed the London bombings, the Bali bombings, the Madrid bombings, the terrible atrocity in Paris last month. But they are using them to try and overthrow the Syrian government and the legitimate leader, President Assad. The Americans know that if the Syrian government was to be overthrown, Russia would lose all its influence in the Middle East. So that's another reason for NATO's existence. And if we take Libya, what was that all about? Well, firstly, it was to gain control of Libya's oil and gas fields. But secondly, it was a way of establishing a NATO presence in Libya. Well, that's been an absolute disaster, because what has happened is that the Americans opened a Pandora's box when they overthrew Colonel Gaddafi. And whether you liked Gaddafi or not, he was the legitimate leader of Libya. Whether you liked him or not is actually irrelevant. He was the legitimate leader of Libya. But when they overthrew him, they opened a Pandora's box. And that was in 2011. In 2015, what's happened? The country is now controlled and run by various Islamist groups, many of which have connections to Al-Qaeda. So wherever NATO goes, it leaves a trail of destruction. And we can turn to Kosovo. Let's have a look about Kosovo. They tore Kosovo away from Serbia. Kosovo was a part of, at the time, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and then Serbia, but they tore it away. And Kosovo today is a center in Europe for organized crime. It's a center for drug trafficking, gun trafficking, and sex trafficking as well. And the Americans teamed up with the Kosovan Liberation Army, which was a terrorist organization, and the State Department, prior to 1999, had listed the KLA as a terrorist organization. All of a sudden, that was changed, but the Americans teamed up with the KLA to fight against the Serbs so that the Americans could have another presence in the Balkans. And today, we have Camp Bondsteel, which is one of the largest American military bases in the world. So the war against Serbia regarding Kosovo was fought to gain another presence for the Americans in the Balkans and to weaken Serbia, which is a historical ally to Russia.
Oh, well said again, Marcus. I know we're going to run out of time in a minute, so there's just so much to say, but thank you very much for all that. And it just keeps coming into my mind all the time, you know. They're not responsible enough to have the power they've got at their fingertips. It's evident again and again with what you're just talking about, with the future, what's happening now. You compare them to Putin. I'm not saying Putin's an angel, but I'm saying their behaviour is like that of a child or a wise man, isn't it? And it's very worrying. And Wesley Clark, I keep bringing this up, said this years ago to people. After 9/11, it was all planned out right through the Middle East, you know, Syria, everybody, and they'll be friends with you when they want something from you, they'll kill you when they won't. And I believe Europe and Merkel and all these people, they know that, you know. And just a quick question before we go, it's completely out of context in a sense. Well, one more thing before I go on and say, I'm worried that they're going to kick the chessboard over because they're losing. That's what I think. But what's his name, Varoufakis, the new Greek finance minister, said the other day that it's like financial waterboarding, and I think it's repelling people against the West now and making it really repellent, you know. And do you think quick question, do you think Greece will go with Russia?
Well, Greece has very good bilateral relations with Russia, and Greece has very good economic relations with Russia. But Greece is a member of the European Union and Greece is a member of NATO. It certainly doesn't have an obsequious relationship with America, unlike for other countries in the European Union and NATO. But still, Greece is in the EU and Greece is in NATO. And while Syriza promised numerous things prior to the election, it's very, very difficult for Greece to be able to achieve really what it wants. Because if we go back to 2012, and it's very important to state this, but prior to the German loans to Greece, in short, the Greek National Bank had no money in it. The only reason it has money today in it is because Germany is pumping so much money into Greece. So that's why we're now seeing in Greece compromise between Syriza and the European Union. What Syriza promised in its election campaign, realistically, they were never going to be able to achieve, because Greece is on a life support machine, and that life support machine is German. If Greece was to leave the Eurozone today, and if Greece was to leave the European Union today, how would it function? It just doesn't have any. It just doesn't have any money. So that's the problem for Syriza, and that's the problem for the Greek people. Once a country goes into the European Union, it's extremely difficult to get out from it. And then also, the Americans exercise a great deal of leverage over the European Union. So the Americans will be putting a lot of pressure on the Greek government and a lot of pressure on Germany to ensure that Greece not just stays in the Eurozone, but stays in the European Union. Because what the Americans don't want is for Greece to, for example, pull out of the European Union, and for it to be in serious trouble, for then potentially Russia to come along and to start investing money in Greece, start pumping up the economy, and thereby have some sort of influence in Greece. That's not what the Americans want. So in short, once a country's in the European Union, it's very difficult for it to get out.
Well said, Marcus. Brilliant. And I'm wondering if Putin will play the trump card and start buying everybody up, like buying Greece up, just to see what happens. But I know we've run out of time here, Marcus, with you. I just want to say thanks very much for coming on the show. There's so much else to talk about, but and let's not forget Putin's an expert judo martial artist, so you never know what he's got up his sleeve. And but on a serious note, before we go, just to say I am very serious about this subject. And it is very, very worrying, like you said, and you shocked me. Not shocked me, but you've said, if they take weapons into there now and arm Ukraine, final word, Marcus, you reckon that that will make Russia retaliate?
Russia didn't lose nearly 30 million of its people in World War II, only to become a slave and to be subdued in the 21st century by America. And the Russians will not tolerate, under any circumstance, NATO, Georgia or Moldova becoming a member of NATO. As I said, they didn't lose 30 million of its people against the Nazis so that America could threaten its security in the 21st century. It won't happen, and the Americans will undoubtedly keep on pursuing their course of action in regard to trying to isolate Russia on its western borders. But likewise, Russia is not going to pull back. Wow,
all bets are off, in other words. Let's keep our fingers crossed, and let's hope that doesn't happen, and sanity prevails. But unfortunately, we've got insane captains on the bridge of the ship, so I'm not sure whether sanity will prevail, but we'll see, and I'm very worried. So Marcus Papadopoulos, I'll just say a website again, editor and publisher of Politics First magazine. That's politicsfirst.org.uk. Thank you so much for coming on the show with me, Marcus. It's fantastic wealth of information to help people understand the madness that we're seeing, and until we see it and understand it, we'll never be able to get out of it. So thanks for joining me, Marcus. It's been great to have you on as a guest, and I appreciate all the fantastic work you're doing.
Thank you very much, Jason, for having invited me on, and I think you're doing a splendid job in conveying the other side of the story to people in Britain and in the wider world.
Thank you, Marcus. Well, I'm doing my best with it, as we all should, and I think we've all got to become a bit like Marcus Papadopoulos now and do our bit to bring about the transformation of the planet, because it's an emergency situation and we need to wake up very quickly and do our bit to bring that into fruition now. So thank you, Marcus. Thank you all my viewers tonight for joining me on Outside the Box, and sorry about that slight technical hitch earlier on, but we got Marcus back, thank goodness, at last. So thank you all very much for joining me, and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye now.